morning. Glad that you're all here. Special welcome to visitors and guests. Glad that you're able to join us and worship with us this morning. We hope and pray this morning's worship is meaningful for you through God's Word, through the music, and through fellowship with one another. We will, as we do every Sunday, we will partake in celebrating communion this morning. Just know that everyone is invited to the table for a blessing or for communion this morning.
When Jesus comes, are you going to be ready? When he calls, are you going to be ready? When Jesus comes to take us home, I'll be ready and awaiting. There won't be no hesitating when Jesus comes to take me home. When Jesus comes, there'll be no crying, no more hurting, no more dying. When Jesus comes to take us home, no more pain and no more sorrow, no more worrying about tomorrow. When Jesus comes to take us home. When Jesus comes, are you going to be ready? When he calls, are you going to be ready? When Jesus comes to take us home, I'll be ready and awaiting. There won't be no hesitating when Jesus comes to take me home. There'll be friends up there to meet us and the Lord right there to greet us when Jesus comes to take us home. With angels' voices soft and tender, by God's grace they'll let us enter when Jesus comes to take us home. When Jesus comes, are you going to be ready? When he calls, are you going to be ready? When Jesus comes to take us home, I'll be ready and awaiting. There won't be no hesitating when Jesus comes to take us home.
The first reading is Jeremiah 11, verses 18 through 20, and it's on page 1192 of the Pew Bibles. Because the Lord revealed their plot to me, I knew it, for at that time he showed me what they were doing. I had been like a gentle lamb led to the slaughter. I did not realize that they had plotted against me, saying, "Let us destroy the tree and its fruit. Let us cut him off from the land of the living, that his name be remembered no more." But, O Lord Almighty, you who judge righteously and test the heart and mind, let me see your vengeance upon them, for to you I have committed my cause. The second reading is James from chapters 3 and chapters 4. It's on page 1883 of the Pew Bible. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show it by his good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come from down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, of the devil. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace raise a harvest of righteousness. What causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? You want something but don't get it. You kill and covet, but you cannot have what you want. You quarrel and fight. You do not have because you do not ask God. When you ask, you do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your pleasures. Submit yourselves then to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Come near to God, and he will come near to you. Wash your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Our gospel reading comes to us from Mark chapter 9. read responsively. Leaving that region, they traveled through Galilee. Jesus didn't want anyone to know he was there, for he wanted to spend time with the disciples and teach them. And he said to them, "The Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of his enemies. He will be killed, but 3 days later he will rise from the dead." They didn't understand what he was saying, however, and they were afraid to ask him what he meant. And after they arrived in Capernaum and settled in a house, Jesus asked his disciples, "What were you discussing out on the road?" But they didn't answer, because they had been arguing about which one of them was the greatest. And he sat down, called the 12 disciples over to him, and said, "Whoever wants to be first must take last place and be the servant of everyone else." Then he put a little child among them. Taking the child in his arms, he said to them, "Anyone who welcomes a little child like this on my behalf welcomes me. And anyone who welcomes me welcomes not only me, but also my Father who sent me." This is the gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. And please be seated. Most of us have been on an escalator at one point in time or another in our lives, right? For some of us, it's a regular occurrence, whether that's at the mall or at the airport or other place, you name it. And most are fairly what I would call, like normal in length, like this one. No big deal. But there are also longer ones, like the ones Jill and I ventured out in D.C. this spring. In Washington, D.C., the DuPont Circle subway station. It measures 188 feet. This one is one of, I think, the 5th longest in D.C., so not necessarily that significant. But the largest or the longest escalator in the world is actually a system of escalators, not a single individual escalator. The world's longest moving stairway ferries tourists up a mountain in the Hubei province of central China. And it's 688 meters long of a structure. That's over 2,250 feet long. And it begins at a resort at the bottom, and then it snakes its way up the mountain to the scenic Enshi Grand Canyon. And that ferries about 7,300 tourists an hour. And 600,000 people a year pay their $3 for their 18-minute ride. Now, for many, these are really cool to go on, right? That would be really fun, especially that one. And it would be really fun to ride on one of these elongated and lingering moving staircases, but for others, it's just not the case. Enter in a disorder called escalophobia, the fear of escalators. The fear of escalators. Escalophobia is a common phobia affecting hundreds of thousands of people around the world. Now, we may laugh at this. We may laugh at this and think it's rather comical that people actually have this fear of escalators. However, it's a real thing. People who experience escalophobia experience sometimes shaking and shivering and trembling, feeling nauseated and dizzy, and feeling like they want to just run away, or all the way up to having full-blown panic attacks. So if you're one of those that fits into this phobia, the rest of us may need to feel a little bit more empathy for you, because for you, your experience, it's very real. So now you might be asking, what do escalators have to do with today's gospel reading, let alone what do they have to do with Jesus? Well, hang in there a moment. For me, as I read today's gospel reading from Mark, there are a number of questions that I believe Jesus is challenging us with, and questions that actually came up from a mentor of mine in regards to this text. And so imagine Jesus asking you, what are you working? Why are you working so hard? What are you trying to achieve? What drives you? When you say that you're trying to get ahead and get to the top, what does that mean? What is ahead? What is the top? It's important to ask questions like these, especially for those of us who are followers of Jesus, because sometimes it seems like we're riding the escalator up while Jesus is riding the escalator down. The disciples were no different. The disciples were intent about climbing the ladder of success, while Jesus was even more determined about going down the ladder towards a life of service to others. And when it comes to the disciples, it's kind of comical, isn't it? And we read throughout the scriptures, because they really don't come across as having it all together. They really don't come across as they seem like they just don't get it. And it's today's reading from the Gospel of Mark is definitely one of those times. Jesus is always living by a different type of script, living a different story than the one that the world hands us. He doesn't follow society's story of striving to be successful, of getting ahead in life. And I alluded to this in last week's sermon. Think about it this way. If you were Jesus' campaign manager, you might be saying to him, "Hey, Jesus, we're going through Galilee, and this is probably the strongest base of your support, Jesus. And we'll get big crowds here, and there will be more traffic on social media. You'll get more hits on our website, and we'll gain some traction in the opinion polls." But then Jesus responds maybe by saying, "I hear you. I hear you, but I really want to keep our presence under wraps. I want us to keep it a secret. I'm more interested in going deep with the few disciples than I am in drawing big crowds, and by doing so, being shallow and not going deep with this kingdom stuff at all." It's just like Jesus, isn't it? Turning the tables on convention. But Jesus was trying to teach them about something completely different. He's like, "Guys, here's what I want you to know. Here's what I want you to know. The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands. I will be killed, and 3 days later, I will rise again." And now when many of us hear these words, we may have heard them before because of our religious upbringing. We hear about Jesus dying on the cross and Jesus' resurrection, and that's absolutely true. Or that we might hear it this way, that there is some kind of divine plan that Jesus is going to be sacrificed to appease an angry God. But it's important to remember that the disciples would not have thought about it this way. The disciples would have been shocked by this because the assumptions that they had, and we probably would assume these things as well if we were in their shoes. Those assumptions are that Jesus is going to win, that Jesus is going to be victorious, that Jesus is going to succeed. I mean, we wouldn't want to follow someone who we think is going to be a failure, would we? Someone who is weak, someone who is going to lose, right? And we would assume that Jesus has to go out and defeat his enemies and lead this successful campaign and successful revolution. And we would be expecting, if anything, that he would come out on top, and we certainly wouldn't want to hear anything about dying. Jesus didn't think that we needed to be saved from the wrath of God. Jesus knows that we needed to be saved from ourselves. Jesus seems to think that we are our own worst enemy. The central part of Jesus' plan was to expose and to bring out of the darkness and into the light the self-destructive tendencies and nature of human beings. And if we understand this, then what Jesus says to his disciples about going to Jerusalem and being killed and then rising again, it starts to make a little more sense. And Jesus saw what most everyone else in his day couldn't see, and that even most of us today can't see. That we can be our own worst enemy. That if we were met with hatred and violence that which Jesus experienced on the cross, that we would want to retaliate and do the same to those who hurt us. In the words of Martin Luther King Jr., Jesus knew that you can't defeat hate with hate. You can't defeat violence with violence. And if you say, let's kill all the bad guys, then you guarantee that you become a bad guy because you don't have the wisdom or authority to decide who should live and who should die. So Jesus' plan from the beginning was to preach peace, was to preach forgiveness, was to preach reconciliation. And not only preach it, but to practice it and to live it. So when Jesus says, okay guys, here's what I really need you to know. We're going to Jerusalem and I'm going to suffer and be murdered and be buried and rise again. And when he says this, he's telling us that we aren't going into Jerusalem with a militia. We're not going into Jerusalem with a large army to take things over. There won't be any sort of war or battle going on. We're going into Jerusalem to practice what we preach. We're going in to practice peace. We're going to practice forgiveness. We're going to practice reconciliation. We're going to practice nonviolence. And when they come for me, and when they come for all of us, we aren't going to put up a fight. And when this happens, Jesus understands his death will not be a sign of his weakness. It will be exposing and bringing to light the violence of those in power who want to kill an unarmed man who preaches and practices peace. Jesus won't be exposed. They will be exposed. And when the Roman Empire and religious leaders think that they have defeated this Jesus, Jesus will use that defeat to overturn their confidence in the systems of hate and fear and violence. This way of Jesus doesn't make any sense at all to the disciples. They were sure that if your enemy is violent, that you have to be more violent. If your enemy is hateful, then you have to be more hateful. And the disciples are too proud to admit to understand or to even agree with what Jesus was saying, and so they start to argue. And they argue about which one of them would be the greatest, and who's on top, and who's to dominate, and you can see how much they just don't get what Jesus is really about. You know what? Can any of you relate to this? Because I can. And so they argue, the disciples argue about who will be the greatest. And then Jesus asked them a question, what were you arguing about when you were walking along the road? And at this point, the disciples seem like they were really embarrassed or too proud or ashamed to answer, and they don't know what to say, and so it gets really quiet and awkward quiet, and you can imagine none of them wanting to even make eye contact with Jesus. And it's then that Jesus does something. Jesus does something so profound. He takes a child and brings her over, puts his arms around the child. I want you to imagine for a moment that Jesus at first doesn't say a word. He's teaching them by demonstrating something. What would they be thinking as their leader, as their rabbi, as their teacher, is sitting and holding a child after all that they've been arguing about who's the greatest. And after they haven't understand why he would ever want to go to Jerusalem, especially if something terrible was going to happen to him there. It's also important to remember that in Jesus' day, people didn't think about children the same way that we think about them today. Of course, parents loved their kids, but it wasn't like our day where we are absolutely in need. We need to know and demonstrate that every child is precious and every child is special and is full of potential. However, in Jesus' day, children were insignificant, not important. They didn't have any status, and certainly they weren't the greatest. And so it's in this light, Jesus holds the child. As he's holding the child, he's overturning, just as he did earlier, he's overturning their assumptions. He's saying that what they think is first, the most important, is actually the last. He's saying that life isn't about competition, it's about love. Life is not about how much you achieve, it's about how you care for those who, like this child, are at the bottom. Those who are the lowest, those who are the least. That's why, as he's holding this child, he speaks about welcome. Whoever welcomes the child, the least of these, welcomes also Jesus and the God who sent Jesus into the world. In our reading from James today, our second reading, the writer says there are two kinds of wisdom. On one hand, there is the wisdom and desire to acquire that creates competition and exclusion and fear. And on the other hand, there is the wisdom and desire to love and to serve that creates a sense of belonging and hospitality. There's an escalator going up, and there's an escalator going down. Jesus makes it clear that he's heading down to serve and to care and to welcome and to love. So, my friends, it leads us to wonder, what kind of direction do you want to take in your life? What kind of direction does the church want to take in our life together? Whose path will we follow? Whose wisdom do we choose? Whose way do we trust? Are we on the escalator heading up, or are we on the escalator heading down? Amen. Go in peace and serve the Lord. Thanks be to God.